It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of day I cherished. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting warm golden stripes across the kitchen floor. I was sipping my coffee, enjoying the serenity of our little corner of suburbia, when I heard my daughter Callie's voice from the driveway. "Mom? Something's wrong with my chair." I set my mug down and hurried outside. Callie was in her wheelchair, looking down at the flat, deflated tires. Her face was a mix of confusion and frustration, a rare expression for my usually cheerful 10-year-old. "What happened, sweetie?" I crouched next to her, inspecting the tires. "I don't know. I left it parked here last night and now," Callie trailed off, her voice tinged with disappointment. My stomach sank as I noticed deep slashes running through the rubber. Someone had deliberately destroyed the tires. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone to take pictures. "Don't worry, Callie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll get this fixed." "Who would do this?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mix of hurt and confusion. I didn't have an answer, but I had a strong suspicion. Our neighborhood HOA president, Karen, had made it clear from the moment we moved in that she didn't approve of our family. Callie's wheelchair seemed to be a particular point of contention for her. Karen had once complained that it cluttered the aesthetic of the sidewalk when Callie left it briefly outside our front door. She was the type of person who thrived on enforcing rules nobody else cared about and making life miserable for those who didn't fit her rigid mold of suburban perfection. Later that morning, as I reviewed the footage from the security cameras we'd installed, my suspicion turned to rage. The grainy black and white video showed Karen, unmistakable in her tailored pantsuit and signature bob haircut, walking down the driveway under the cover of darkness. She glanced over her shoulder before crouching next to Callie's wheelchair. In a swift, practiced motion, she pulled a blade from her pocket and slashed the tires. I sat back in my chair, my blood boiling. Karen didn't just dislike us, she was targeting my child. This wasn't just petty HOA nonsense anymore. This was personal. Callie peeked over my shoulder, curious about the footage. "Is that Karen?" she asked, her voice small. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without swearing. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to make sure she never does this again," I said firmly. The rest of the day was a blur of emotions: anger, disbelief, and a growing resolve. Karen thought she could intimidate us, that her position as HOA president gave her the power to act without consequences. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. The next morning, I woke up with a mission. Karen thought she could get away with slashing my daughter's wheelchair tires and walking off like it was just another HOA errand. She was wrong. I started by saving multiple copies of the security footage. One went onto a secure cloud server, another onto a USB drive, and a third onto an external hard drive. Karen wasn't the type to back down easily, and I wanted to be prepared for whatever stunt she might try to pull next. After breakfast, I called Claire, a friend and neighbor who had lived in the community for years. Claire had her own horror stories about Karen's micromanaging, and I figured she might have some insight. "Karen did what?" Claire's voice practically crackled through the phone. "Slashed the tires on Callie's wheelchair," I said, my voice tight with anger. "I caught her on camera." "Oh honey, you've got her now," Claire said with a mix of sympathy and determination. "She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. I've got files of her bogus fines and complaints. Want them?" "I'll take anything you've got," I said. By the afternoon, Claire was at my kitchen table, a stack of HOA violation notices and meeting minutes in front of her. It turned out Karen had a long history of issuing fines for absurd reasons: too many holiday lights, planting flowers that weren't community approved, and even penalizing a neighbor for a barking dog that didn't exist. "She's been using her position to bully people," Claire said, flipping through the papers. "She keeps people scared enough not to fight back." "Well, not anymore," I said, clenching my jaw. With Claire's help, I started piecing together a picture of Karen's reign of terror. But this wasn't just about neighborhood politics anymore. This was about Callie. I took the security footage and evidence of Karen's history to the local sheriff's office. The deputy I spoke to didn't try to downplay the situation, which was a relief. "This is vandalism," he said firmly, watching the footage. "And considering it's a child's wheelchair, the court might see it as aggravated circumstances." "Good," I said. "She deserves it." Meanwhile, I submitted a formal complaint to the HOA board. The complaint wasn't just about the vandalism. It outlined Karen's misuse of her position, the countless fines she'd issued without proper cause, and the way she'd harassed our family since day one. That evening, I got an email from Karen herself. Subject: violation notification, unauthorized surveillance. Body: It has come to my attention that you have installed security cameras without HOA approval. This is a violation of our guidelines and you will be fined $500. Please remove the cameras immediately. I couldn't help but laugh. Karen was predictable if nothing else. She thought she could scare me into submission. Instead of replying, I forwarded the email to the HOA board with a short note. I believe this speaks for itself. For further context, please refer to the attached footage of Karen vandalizing my daughter's wheelchair. The response from the board came faster than I expected. They called an emergency meeting to address the situation. Karen, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued her usual routine of patrolling the neighborhood and issuing petty fines. By the time the meeting rolled around, the tide had already started to turn. Neighbors who'd been too scared to speak out were now sharing their own stories of Karen's overreach. Claire and I had spent days gathering statements and they painted a damning picture. When Karen walked into the meeting, she carried herself with the smug confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. That confidence faltered the moment the security footage started playing on the projector screen. Gasps filled the room as the video showed Karen slashing the tires. The silence that followed was deafening. I can explain, Karen stammered, her face pale. Explain what? I said, standing up. That you vandalized a child's wheelchair? That you've been abusing your power to harass this community? Or that you think you're above the law? Karen's jaw worked, but no words came out. For the first time since we moved in, I saw fear in her eyes. The meeting ended with the board voting unanimously to suspend Karen's authority pending further investigation. As I walked out, I felt a glimmer of satisfaction. But I wasn't done yet. Over the next few days, Karen's suspension sent ripples through the neighborhood. Without her usual micromanaging, people started to open up more. Claire and I became the unofficial coordinators for gathering stories and evidence, and it turned out Karen's reign of terror was even worse than we thought. There was the single mom fined for letting her kids' chalk art stay on the driveway too long. The elderly couple accused of having illegal bird feeders in their backyard. Even the local mailman had a story about Karen threatening to report him for parking too close to the curb. But this wasn't just about getting even, it was about ensuring she could never wield that kind of power again. I started by setting up a private neighborhood group chat, free from HOA oversight. Within hours, it was buzzing with messages. People shared their experiences, their frustrations, and their anger. The more stories we collected, the more clear it became. Karen's behavior wasn't just petty, it was targeted and abusive. Meanwhile, I worked on securing the legal side of things. I sent the security footage, along with a detailed report of Karen's actions, to the HOA's legal counsel. The lawyer responded quickly, acknowledging the severity of the situation and promising a thorough investigation. Karen, however, wasn't going down without a fight. She started trying to rally her few loyal supporters, spreading rumors that I was anti-community and only out to cause trouble. Her attempts backfired spectacularly. One neighbor shared screenshots of Karen's messages in the group chat, further solidifying her image as a bully. By the time the HOA board called the next meeting, the neighborhood was firmly on my side. The meeting room was packed. Karen sat at the far end of the table, her face tight with anger as the board opened the floor for complaints. I didn't waste any time. I stood up and presented a slideshow that included the security footage of Karen slashing Callie's wheelchair tires, statements from over a dozen neighbors detailing Karen's harassment, records of HOA funds misappropriated for Karen's personal projects, like the overpriced community garden that conveniently ended up in her backyard. The evidence was damning. Karen's face turned redder with each slide, and by the end she was openly glaring at me. "This is a witch hunt," she snapped. "None of this proves anything." "That's where you're wrong," I said, pulling out one last piece of evidence. It was a copy of Karen's financial transactions, provided by an anonymous tip. It showed that she'd been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including landscaping services and even a spa day. The room erupted in murmurs. Karen tried to defend herself, but it was clear the tide had turned. The HOA board voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position. They also announced an independent audit of the HOA's finances and promised to review and reform the bylaws Karen had weaponized against the community. But the real victory came later that evening. I set up a projector in my driveway and invited the entire neighborhood for a movie night. Instead of a film, I played a montage of Karen's greatest hits, her patrols, her petty complaints, and of course the footage of her slashing Callie's wheelchair tires. The laughter and cheers from the crowd were cathartic. Karen, who lived just down the street, stayed inside with her curtains drawn. As I sat with Callie watching her laugh along with the neighbors, I felt a sense of closure. Karen had tried to make our lives miserable, but in the end she had only managed to isolate herself. Now the neighborhood was coming together in a way it never had before. And Karen? She had finally met her match. You said. The aftermath of Karen's downfall was nothing short of poetic. The neighborhood, once shackled by her iron grip, was finally free to breathe. People who had tiptoed around her petty rules began to emerge, their spirits lighter, their smiles brighter. Karen, on the other hand, retreated into her fortress of a home, blinds drawn, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Her resignation from the HOA was swift and absolute, accompanied by a legal settlement for misusing funds and vandalism charges. Part of her penalty included reimbursing Callie's wheelchair damages, along with a court-mandated public apology. That apology was as painful to watch as it was to deliver. At the next HOA meeting, Karen stood at the front, her face flushed and her voice trembling. I apologize for my actions, she said, clearly choking on the words. I understand the harm I've caused and I will strive to make amends. The neighborhood watched in silence, arms crossed and unimpressed. When she hurried out afterward, the crowd erupted into quiet cheers. It wasn't just about justice, it was about reclaiming a sense of community. With Karen gone, the HOA went through a massive overhaul. The bylaws were reviewed and rewritten to eliminate the loopholes Karen had exploited. The board, once dominated by her cronies, welcomed new, fair-minded members. I even joined as a consultant to ensure that families like mine would never face this kind of harassment again. One of our first community projects was a wheelchair-accessible playground, funded in part by the money Karen had been forced to return. Callie was ecstatic. Watching her laugh and race other kids down the smooth, ramped paths made every sleepless night and confrontation worth it. Meanwhile, Karen's social standing in the neighborhood plummeted. Gone were the days of her smug patrols and unwarranted fines. She became an object of pity and mild ridicule, a cautionary tale whispered about at barbecues and block parties. The ultimate poetic justice came on a warm Saturday morning, the kind Karen used to claim as her inspection days. Callie and I were out front, planting sunflowers in the garden, when a moving truck pulled into Karen's driveway. She emerged, looking worn and defeated, and began supervising the movers as they loaded box after box into the truck. Is she leaving? Callie asked, her hands still in the dirt. Looks like it, I said, brushing a smudge of soil from her cheek. As Karen walked to her car for the last time, she glanced in our direction. For a moment, her gaze lingered. Then she got into the car, slammed the door, and drove away without a word. The neighborhood threw a potluck that evening, celebrating not just Karen's departure but the newfound sense of unity. People laughed, shared stories, and toasted to the future. Later that night, as Callie and I sat under the stars, she turned to me with a thoughtful look. Do you think she'll ever change? I considered the question for a moment. I don't know, sweetie. But I hope she learned something from all this. Callie nodded, satisfied with the answer. As for me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Karen's tyranny was over, and in its place, we had built something stronger. A neighborhood that looked out for one another and stood together against injustice. And if Karen ever tried to pull something like this again, well, the security cameras were staying right where they were. You said.